Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Today I'm going to be installing a RadioWavz 80-4 fan dipole. I actually got this antenna from Don, W1FYG, better known as Smoke Signals RF, on YouTube over a year ago. I just haven't gotten around to putting it up yet. Now the reason I want to put it up today is because my current antenna, an 80 and 40 meter homebrew fan dipole, has come down. A branch came down on one of the legs. I was inspecting the wire and I realized it's kind of old and brittle. This thing's been up here since 2015, so that's 6 years now. The other reason I thought it would be good to start this project today is because it's cold and windy out, and that's when you're supposed to work on antennas. Anyway, I'm going to grab the camera. I'm going to go freehand, so it might get a little shaky, but I'll show you the old antenna before I take it down. So first, here's a look at the leg that came down. You can see that the insulation on the wire is all cracked and pulling apart. I got some bare copper there. You just kind of see it's just generally in brittle condition. This is just 14 gauge THHN wire that I picked up from Home Depot in the first place, so it's actually done pretty well, all things considered. So here's a look at my feed point. Now it's made of a piece of scrap AZEK PVC trim board, and you can see there's a couple of copper straps there with some nuts and bolts through it to kind of hold everything together. But as you can see, not only is the wire brittle, but there's a lot of corrosion on it. So time to get something better up here now. So at each of the ends of the four legs, I've got an insulator with the antenna wire on one end, in this case the left side, and then some black Dacron or paracord rope on the other end. Then if I pan over here, you can see that I've got just an eye hook up there in the tree, and my rope just wraps around the eye hook. And that essentially works sort of like a pulley. And then I've got the rope coming down the trunk of the tree, down here to an eye hook at the bottom where I've got the excess tied off. So now what I can do is just untie each of these legs and let the ends down without actually taking them out of the tree. So the feed point on the new antenna is obviously going to be better than my cobbled together scrap bin stuff. But I am going to keep my end supports kind of the way that I've got them. That seems to be working well. So I started working on taking down the legs of my antenna. So since I haven't touched these, you can see that the tree is even growing over the rope here in some sections. Down here somewhere is an eye hook that's buried in here. I'll have to cut some of this out and find it. Rope is still plenty strong, but it is kind of stiff, so I'm going to change it out for new stuff while I'm at it. So I don't know how well you guys are going to be able to see this, but I did cut this support rope, and it should be slipping through the eye hook that's up there in the top of the tree, but the tree has grown so much over it, it won't budge. So here's a look at the feed point of the new antenna. You can see that this section here is a balun, has a nice SO239 connector on it, so I don't have to cobble together any wires. And then back here we have a nice mounting point, and then all the wires are nice and strain relieved here on the ends, and then tied into the feed point here. So this ought to work out okay. Now I started fooling with this antenna last year, and one of the things I was trying to figure out was how I was going to mount this. As you saw in my other configuration, I only have points for 2 wires, but this antenna is 4. So what I tried to do is I tried to make these spreaders out of some old black PVC pipe that I cut up and drilled holes in, and then I zip tied the wires to it. And I guess it's okay, it'll spread the wires, but at the end of the day, it's kind of heavy and kind of ugly. So I don't think I'm going to go with this configuration. I think I'm going to do something else. So the first thing I do before I do anything else is I'm going to clip these spreaders out of here and just have the bare wires dangling. As you can see, I've got the feed point of the new antenna mounted in the tree. And I figured it was best to wait to do this until it was actually snowing out, just to give myself a little bit of an extra challenge. So I ended up replacing the old eye hook with one that was one size bigger. The old one was a little bit bent. But the idea is to allow the feed point to pivot and move as the wires themselves also kind of move as the trees they're mounted to sway in the breeze. And that kind of helps relieve some of the strain on the feed point. So since it worked well for the old feed point, I decided to just keep with that method here. So I'm over here with the end of my 80 meter leg, and I'm going to start putting this up. So for end insulators, this is what my old set was. I picked these up at a Hamfest, and they seem to do the job fairly well. Although they are a little bit old, they're sun faded and probably brittle at this point, so I'm going to replace them. So the new insulators are actually electric fence end insulators that I found at Tractor Supply. I got a whole bag of these for like $6 or $7 or something like that. Anyway, these look like they're made out of the same material, just a little bit different design. Now, one thing to keep in mind with end insulators is if you're going to run a lot of power, the material can matter. Now, I'm going to be running maybe 200 watts at most, so this plastic insulator should be fine. If I were ever going to run an amplifier, especially if I were going to go up over 600 watts or so, I would probably want to use ceramic insulators with a little bit of a different design so that the wire wouldn't overlap the rope as it will with this one. And the reason for that is at the higher powers, the insulators can actually start to kind of break down and arc over to the support ropes, especially if it's wet outside. But like I said, I don't run any more than 200 watts, so something like this is more than adequate for my needs. So my old background rope was actually in pretty decent shape, all things considered, but decided to change that out while I was here too. Now you can find this stuff anywhere, and arguably you may be able to get it fairly inexpensively. I ended up getting this stuff from my hardware store since it was the easiest place to go. Either way, this stuff should work fine. So here's my end insulator setup. Over here on this side is the antenna wire, and you can see I've just got it twisted back on itself, and I've got some UV resistant zip ties securing the twist. Now I may end up having to cut these zip ties and change the length of the fold back here when it's time to tune the antenna, but just in case it doesn't require any tuning, I decided to put the zip ties on now. So over here on the rope side, you can see I've tied it off to the insulator, and again I've used zip ties to hold the end of the rope, and that's mostly because I failed knot tying class in Cub Scouts back in the day. So the zip ties will prevent everything from coming undone over time. And then the other thing to kind of mention with this style of end insulator, you can see I've got the antenna wire through this hole and I've got the rope through this hole. And what that means is that if this insulator were to ever crack or fail, the rope and the antenna wire should hold each other together, and the antenna will droop, but it shouldn't actually come down. So this happens to be the tree that grew over the hardware, so I had to start with a new hook here. And you can see I've got my rope threaded through the hook, and now I'm just working on pulling it down through. And of course, as I pull it through the hook, then the wire will go in the air. Not sure if you guys can see that or not, but I've got pretty much full tension on the wire now. But before I tie it off, I actually want to let it back down. And the reason for that is so that I can cut the rope so that I have enough length so that in the future I can lower it without having to go up on the ladder and fish it back through the hook up there. Okay, so I've got the rope cut. Now I'm gonna use the melt the end trick here to keep the end from fraying over time. This is something that my recess supervisor from 2nd grade taught us one time when we were out on the playground and some rope came apart on us. So that melted the end over, and it shouldn't fray over time. Now that I've got that all set, I can put tension back on the antenna and tie this off, and we'll be ready to move on to the next element. So you get the idea. That's pretty much how I'm going to put all of these elements up in the trees. So I'm going to do that now for the other 80 meter element and the 240 meter elements. And then I'll have to figure out what to do with the others once those are up in the air and I can see what everything looks like. So it's actually been a week since the filming of the last clip. I ended up getting sick and had to stop working on this for a little while, but that gave me some time to kind of think things through, and I now know what my plan is going to be for putting up the rest of the elements. In fact, here's part of it. I ended up ordering some 550 cord on Amazon, which is what I should have done in the first place. This roll of 250-foot cord cost me just a little bit more than a whole 100 feet did at the hardware store. But either way, I think I've got enough material to finish the job here now. Obviously, you can see the snow is gone and the sun is out, so conditions are a little better today. I'll see how far I can get. So during my hiatus, I also realized I made sort of a mistake putting up the 80 meter legs. Now, I'm not going to tell you what it is just yet. I will let you know later in the video because I'm going to have to deal with it. But if you guys know what it is before I get to it, drop it in the comments and let me know. Maybe some of you already realized what I did. But for now, I'm going to get the rest of the legs up. So I've got all the legs of the antenna put up. Now, I'll do my best to kind of show you how they're configured, but it's going to be a little hard to see things in the camera, obviously. Black wire and black rope and kind of bright sunshine, but I'll do my best. So there's a look at the feed point. Hopefully you guys can see it well enough in the camera. All the legs are all stretched out now, and you can see I've got my coax connected up. Now I don't have the coax waterproofed yet because I may need to take it off again. So I'll do that later. So now if I pan to the right, this is the south side of the antenna. And you can see that two wires, they slope a little bit, but they basically go off to the trees. Those are the 80 and 40 meter legs. The ones over here that slope down are the 10 and 20 meter legs. And the way these are configured is I've got them tied off the poles over here. And the reason I did it that way was because I just didn't have enough rope to go to various trees. I don't have any closer trees for the shorter legs. So I decided to do this, at least for now, and see how it works. So now if I look over here at the north side, you can see I pretty much did the same thing. The 40 and 80 meter legs go off to trees over there in the distance. The 40 meter is where the ladder is. The 80 meter is off over there. The 20 and 10 are sloped down over here and tied off the poles just like before. The only difference here is that we've got sort of a V instead of the wires being able to kind of go straight where I would have liked them. And that's because I have sort of a cauldron here in the hillside. The reason for that is when they built the house, they dug a bunch of fill out of here and put it in the front yard. So the front yard wasn't as steep as it could have been, but ended up with this cauldron over here. So this configuration isn't ideal, but I don't think it's bad either. It's more or less the best compromise I could come up with the land and the trees and everything the way that I've got. And at the very least, it should get me through winter. One thing I'm not real happy about with this antenna is the fact that the longer legs are the ones that I've got higher up. Really, we'd want the 20 and the 10 meter legs as high as we can get them, and I could probably live with the 40 and 80 being lower, but the way the antenna is designed, the longer legs are the ones that are sort of on the top of the feed point, so they had to go above the other legs. Either way, I think this is going to work just fine for the type of operating that I do right now, especially to get me through the winter. Maybe in the spring I'll come up with something else, but for now, this should work. Let's head in, put this thing on an analyzer, and see where it's at. I know we're going to have to do some tuning. So I've got the antenna connected up to my MFJ analyzer. I'm going to start off about 3 megahertz here, and we'll start to tune up into the 80 meter band. And as I head up in frequency, you can see that right around 3.4 megahertz, we get the best SWR, about 1.2, and the lowest feed point impedance, which is resistive in about 125 ohms or so. Once I start going up into the actual 80 meter band and even beyond that into the 75 meter portion, you can see that the input impedance keeps going up, and so does the SWR. So what that means is I'm going to have to trim the 80 meter legs back a little bit. So now let's check out 40 meters. Now we're going to come in from above the band. You can see we're at 7.8 megahertz now, and I'm going to tune down into the band, and you can see things start to look pretty good and actually look really good right at about 7 megahertz. We get 1.0 SWR and an input impedance of about 60 ohms, well, even down into the 50s. And again, because everything is looking good near the bottom of the band or the lower frequency, that means the legs are just a little bit long and need to be trimmed. So now let's head up into the 20 meter territory and see what that looks like. And you can see here, if I get, well, just a little bit above the 20 meter band, things are looking really good, 1.0 and about 60 ohms input impedance, which I'm a little surprised by that. I didn't think we'd get really all that great on 20, but what this tells me is that those legs are a little bit too short, which of course is a little more difficult than just trimming back the wire. So I may not do anything with these. I may leave them, at least for now anyway. So now if I tune up into the 15 meter band, things are looking like they work out best just a little bit above the 15 meter band. Now, 15 meters on this antenna doesn't have its own dedicated leg. It's working off of a resonance on the 40 meter legs. Now, when I tune the 40 meter legs, the 15 meter readings may get worse. We'll have to see how that plays out, but I am going to optimize this antenna for 40 since I do have another antenna that tunes up on 15. So I won't worry too much about what happens here on 15. So if I tune through the 10 meter band, you can see, again, this one looks like it's best sort of towards the top of the band. And again, in order to get this down lower into the sideband portion of the band, I'd have to add wire. So just like 15, I do have another antenna that works pretty well on 10. So I don't really need the 10 meter on this one. So I'll probably leave it as it is, and maybe I'll use it to experiment in the FM portion of the band. So now I'm going to throw a little bit of math at you so you understand how I came up with how much I needed to trim each of my legs by to tune the antenna. So up top, I have the frequency that I use to figure out the total length of my dipole. And that is the length in feet equals 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So taking my 80 meter condition first, if you recall, the analyzer showed that the antenna was best right around 3.4 megahertz. So if I plug 3.4 megahertz into the formula, I get a total length of 137.65 feet or 68.82 feet for each leg. So since I wanted the antenna best at 3.8 megahertz, I threw 3.8 into the formula and came up with 123.16 total, or 61.58 for each leg. And if I subtract the target from the initial, I come up with a difference of 7.24 feet. So that means I need to cut about 7.25 feet off of each leg, and then the antenna should be resonant at 3.8. Now I can plug all the numbers in for the 40 meter band and it'll work the same way. So the analyzer showed that we were at 7 megahertz. These are the total lengths, but I want the antenna best at 7.225. So these work out to be the lengths, and that's a total difference of 1 foot. Now a little bit of a spoiler alert. I did this math in my head, and when I did, I estimated this one correctly, but this one I ended up estimating at 8 feet. And I ended up cutting the 80 meter legs just a little bit too short, and you'll see how that works out in the next couple of clips. Now if I had cut back the 80 meter legs by the 7.24 feet instead of the 8 feet that I used, I would have been a little happier with my 80 meter tuning. So like I said, I did the math correctly for the 40 meter, I cut my wires back by 1 foot, and it came out perfect. But now, what I'm going to do is start trimming these legs down. So the first thing I'm going to do is untie this rope from this tree and start letting down my 80 meter legs one at a time, and we'll shorten them up. So this is where we get to the part where I mentioned earlier in the video that I made a little bit of a mistake, or maybe some short-sightedness here. What I want to do now is take this 80 meter leg and I need to trim it. But I need to trim it by probably 7 or 8 feet to get it where I want in sort of the voice portion of the band. And what that means is over there on my rope, I cut it so that I had just enough slack so that I could let the antenna down, and I got the end of the rope here. But if I cut 8 feet off of this thing, it's going to be way up here and I won't be able to reach it. So I may have to add a little bit to my rope. Not a big deal, but didn't think that through when I cut it. So I may end up wasting a little time here, but I didn't want to take the whole 8 feet off right away. I figured I would take about half that, or 4 feet, and test it out and see what things look like. Now, this should work by just taking my 4 feet, wrapping the wire around itself here, and putting it back up. I shouldn't actually have to trim it. Now, once I do get the length where I want, I probably am going to trim it because I just don't want, excess bits of wire hanging around. It just looks weird. So, but for now, while I'm tuning it, just to make sure I don't cut things too short, this is what I'll do. So we'll slide this leg back up in the air and then go do the other one and test it out. So let's look at the analyzer. I'm going to start around 3.2 megahertz and sweep up to 3.4. Now, if you remember from before, 3.4 is where things looked the best before I folded back the wires. So at 3.4, we're getting 1.5 SWR and 184 ohms of input impedance. But now, if I keep sweeping up, you can see that right around 3.6 or so is where things look the best now. So I'm about halfway there. I'd really like the antenna optimized somewhere right around 3.8 megahertz. So based on the analyzer results, I need to take about another 4 feet off the 80 meter leg. So I'll just keep going through the process until I get everything where I want on the analyzer. And once I'm happy with what I see on the analyzer, I'll probably trim back the excess on the wires, and then I'll move over and repeat this process on the 40 meter legs. So I've got my tuning done. Let's check the final results. So I guess I flew a little too close to the sun on Wings of Pastrami with this. I really wanted it sort of centered on 3.8, and it's not bad at 3.8, but it's actually best closer to 3.9. I think it'll be okay for the type of operating I do, but I wish I hadn't cut the wire back already. I'd like to add maybe a foot back to it to get it down to here. So now, taking a look at 40 meters, I took about 1 foot off of each leg, and it now is just about perfect where I want it, right at 7.225. So we're looking real good on 40 now. I'm happy with that. Now, I didn't touch the 20 meter legs. So they're still centered right around 14.5 or so. And like I said, I'm going to live with that for now. I'm not going to try and add any wire to those legs. I wanted to take a look at 15 and see if that got any worse from the last time, since the 15 meter really works as a harmonic of 40. And if I scroll up through the band here, it looks like it's, well, a little worse than it was before, kind of as we expected it might be. But that's okay. I don't use 15 a whole lot, and when I do, I have another antenna for that band. Now, I didn't touch the 10 meter legs, but for whatever reason, it looks like the center frequency got a little bit lower. Before, it was up around 29.5, and now it's closer to 28.5. But like I said, for 15, I've got that other antenna I use for 10, so I'm not too worried about what's going on with 10 here. Unfortunately, I didn't have the camera rolling for the next bit, but here's the aftermath.
Okay. Whiskey 3, Hotel November, Japan, Kilo Bravo, Quebec, Sierra.
So I just hooked up the antenna just to see what was happening. I tuned her on 40 meters. The very first signal I heard was a JK station from Japan. I went back to him. He heard me on the first call. I can't believe it. He even said that he was beaming long path, so that's got to be my furthest contact ever. Now, I'm going to attribute some of that to band conditions, but I guess that antenna's working pretty well. So I'm pretty happy with where everything is now with the antenna. So that's where I'm going to run it for the winter. The last thing I need to do is go back out and waterproof the coax connector, and then just make sure all the lines are tied off tightly so this thing will survive the winter. Now in the spring, I'll probably make some adjustments to this antenna, or I might take it down and replace it with something completely new. I guess time will tell. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to learn more about my channel, check the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.